Thank you so much. Yes, first, I'd like to say a big thank you for being included in today's presentations, all of which have given me a lot to think about with my own work. In the decade before World War II, the Soviet Union underwent enormous industrial development. Stalin's five-year plans propelled the country at great cost from a predominantly agricultural society to one with huge industrial centers. One rapidly developing sector was the optical industry, virtually non-existent before 1928. By 1941, several optical factories were producing hundreds of thousands of cameras yearly. What motivated this exponential growth of camera manufacturing? The state's investment did not align with amateur photography's cultural moment. Throughout the 1920s, amongst other exciting revolutionary artistic movements, a push for amateur photographers emerged. The image of the proletariat accessing art through modern technology fit nicely into the revolutionary ideology of the time. As art historian Valery Stigniev notes, this proletariat photography movement met its end, like other amateur artistic movements, such as the more famous Prolet cult, during the first five-year plan from 1928 to 1932. The first period of economic acceleration coincided with what Sheila Fitzpatrick has dubbed the Cultural Revolution, a total social shift that included the consolidation of the arts under the state. The Soviet camera industry thus took off in the early 1930s, just as amateur photography disappeared from cultural discourse. If camera factories were not growing to supply amateur photographers, why were they growing? My research has found that prior to World War II, optical factories largely produced for elite buyers, from professional photographers to the Red Army and the NKVD, which was the secret police and the administrator of the Gulag. For example, the Fed camera model was included in categorizations of military technology. Optical technology and the camera's inclusion amongst military tools by the state brought in investment as the Soviet Union mobilized as World War II approached. The Soviet Union, in some ways, since its inception, had been anticipating war with capitalist Europe. But the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany in 1933 accelerated the push for war preparedness. Throughout the 1930s, as mobilization ramped up, the focus on military goods could be a double-edged sword for camera production, as more resources were pushed to weapons and equipment. Nonetheless, the models developed during this time would, after the war, be the same models sold to amateurs, now marketed as family-friendly hobby equipment. In this presentation, I will briefly sketch the different models developed, their production in connection with mobilization, and their pre-war marketing. I will end by flashing forward to after World War II, when many of the same models would be in the hands of amateurs. The Soviet optical industry was based primarily in Leningrad. The state optical and mechanical plant, which was abbreviated as GOMS, the largest of the city's four optical plants, was run by the Defense Ministry. In his 1937 speech assessing the factory's successes and failures, the factory's director, I.A. Uvarov, noted that while optical work had not always been seen as militarily significant, it had since been recognized as, quote, of great importance in strengthening the nation's defense, unquote. While cameras were categorized as the plant's civilian products, Uvarov pointed out that even those products were of, quote, great importance to the military, unquote. Uvarov stressed throughout his address that the factory was most attentive to the demands of the military, putting civilian demands secondary. In the 1930s, Goetz produced three primary lines of civilian cameras: the Photocore, the Touriste, and the Sport. Photocore cameras, as the name suggests, as it's the short form of photo correspondent, were meant for journalists, while Sport and Touriste cameras were aimed at amateurs. The first Photocore prototype was created in 1929, and the first models released featured German-made shutters, making the price of manufacture expensive. By 1931, the camera was entirely Soviet-made, thanks to new Soviet shutters based on the German model. By the end of 1940, around 1.3 million photocores were made, and they were sold around the price of 170 rubles each, depending on the year. The sport camera, launched in 1936, had two viewfinders and was equipped with the removable Soviet-made Industar 10 lens and was designed for 35mm film. The lower production of sport cameras highlights Goems's priorities, with only 19,000 produced by 1940. A set that included a sport camera, two film cassettes, and a case cost about 600 rubles. The idea for the sport camera came from engineer A.O. Gelgar in 1930, and it was based off an earlier model, the Filmonka. Despite positive reviews from many sectors, including the key sector of the General Staff of the Red Army, the sport model's development made little progress until 1936. In 1937, Uvarov blamed the slow development of an amateur-focused camera on, quote, sluggishness and carelessness, unquote, insisting that the factory had the capacity to be releasing new models to meet the high consumer demands. Perhaps more significant than worker or manager carelessness, however, was the need for materials and specialists, which Goem's leadership seemed to have focused on improving the photo core and military technology. Lastly, Goem's released the amateur-focused tourist camera between 1934 and 1938. Also designed by A.O. Gelgar and modeled off of the German Zeiss camera Vibe, around 150,000 were made. Unlike the sport, the tourist was a small folding camera featuring the Soviet Industar 7 lens and a Goem's-made shutter. This shutter, the Vario, was criticized at the time as unfit for the high-quality lens, and it marred the camera's quality as a whole. A review of the camera's features in Soviet Photo, which was a popular photo journal at the time, complained that Goem's had, quote, wasted its strengths on hybrids that are not entirely successful in terms of design, like the tourist, unquote. The review's use of hybrids suggests that the camera was marketed as capable of many different types of photography. Due to the shutter, however, the critics suggested it would only be fit for amateurs who, quote, do not practice photography in depth, unquote. Despite this complaint, the camera was relatively easy to use and cheap to make, making it Goems's most produced amateur or hybrid model in the pre-war years. The criticism of its hybrid nature also helps explain the focus on the photo core, which was a camera designed and imagined for one specific user. While Goem's produced the largest quantity of cameras in the 1930s, the most famous pre-war Soviet camera was the Fed, which was a copy of the popular German Leica II. The Fed was named after Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky and manufactured at the Children's Labor Commune in Kharkiv. Goem's produced under the umbrella of the defense industry, but the Fed commune was governed through the NKVD as it was a labor camp. The impetus behind the Fed's conception was a desire to prove the capabilities of Soviet technological innovation to foreign competitors. An account of the commune's first 10 years by A. Reutenberg recalls a discussion of Soviet optical mechanical capability, during which a foreign scientist allegedly said, "Hair will grow from my palm before these hicks can create a Soviet Leica," unquote. Taking on the challenge was about creating extremely accurate and complex products, not easily reproducible or easy to use or cheap to make. To be a success, the Soviet Leica had to not just exist, it had to also be the highest caliber piece of technology possible. The first prototype Fed was created in 1932. And in 1934, the camera began mass production in earnest, with 10,000 cameras produced by the end of 1935. The commune was a significantly smaller operation than Goem's, and the Feds were complicated and expensive to create. Only roughly 100,000 were produced prior to the war, but the Fed would go on to be the model for the most well-known post-war cameras, the Zorky and the Zenit. By 1938, the commune's initial purpose of rehabilitating juvenile delinquents through labor had been pushed aside in favor of quality production of the Feds and a new line of sniper scopes. The, quote, specificity of production, unquote, of these highly technical products seemed to be a poor fit for the commune's teenage population And in 1938, the commune was entirely split from the factories so as to increase production by using only civilian workers. In 1939, under the leadership of V.S. Berman, the factory undertook a new project, sniper rifle scopes, identified as PE. The decision followed several denied requests in 1937 and 1938 from NKVD leadership for the commune to manufacture other technologies, such as a panoramic Leica, aerial photography, and rifles themselves. Berman then reached out to the Commissariat of Defense, not the NKVD, who was his boss, for their advice on what to produce, given the current technology and supplies available in the commune. He emphasized that the new product should be, quote, coordinated with the needs of the country's defense, unquote, with marketability a secondary feature. The focus on military production at the end of the 1930s was a double-edged sword for camera technology, however. On the one hand, militarization prompted the split from the commune and a sharp increase in camera production. Over half of the 100,000 Feds produced before June 1941 were produced after 1938. On the other, resources were temporarily moved from camera manufacturing to scope manufacturing. In 1939, before the factory had developed a separate workshop for PE scopes, workers were removed from working on cameras to manufacturing the scopes. Factory leadership noted that resources would be reallocated to build Plant 3, dedicated to scope production, and that would require capital and manpower to be removed from Fed production. As put in a directive from the NKVD in 1941, Berman was to focus all future factory production on military goods so as to align with the nationwide decree for Soviet-wide economic priorities for that year, prior, of course, to the invasion in June 1941. What counted as military is not specified, but the factory continued to make Fed cameras alongside the scopes and the new periscope model, the TR, suggesting the camera was included under the umbrella of military goods. The production of these cameras thus was tied up with mobilization efforts, and marketing and sales further demonstrates the camera's place in the state's eyes as an elite piece of technology. Prior to World War II, both the Leningrad optical industry and the Fed camera factory produced cameras marketed to primarily either professionals or other elite users. Actual purchases, however, could be more diverse. Despite its name and express purposes, evidence suggests that the photocore was indeed a camera used and bought by amateurs. A 1935 advertisement for a photo contest in Pravda, the daily newspaper, notes that, quote, the majority of cameras in the hands of amateurs are photocore cameras, unquote. A book released at the same year as an instruction manual for the photocore described it as an answer to every question of amateur photography practice. The manual included detailed instructions on working the camera, as well as drawings showing how to use the viewfinder, remove the film, and understand all the different pieces. All of these instructions were aimed at someone with very little experience with any camera, not a trained photojournalist. Also appealing to amateurs, for much of the 1930s, the photocore was one of the cheapest models available, sold at only 167 rubles in 1938. The other mass available model, the Touriste, was sold for 157. Both of these prices were equivalent to about a month's salary for an average worker, and therefore were still a relatively expensive product. While the photocore was named for professionals, but accessible to and bought by largely amateurs, the Fed camera was conceived of and bought as an elite luxury product throughout the pre-war period. To purchase the Fed individually, it cost 1,500 rubles, so about 10 times that of the Touriste, although the Fed did come in a kit with an enlarger and other supplies. Three main types of institutions ordered directly from the Fed factory: scientific and journalistic organizations, NKVD branches, and military branches. The first of these three included the Institute of Metrology and Standardization and the Central Hydrodynamic Institute. Both requested Feds on the grounds that it was the only high enough quality camera for their experiments available to purchase. Alongside sending these cameras to these institutions for use and review, the factory elicited support for professional photographers. Many of the most prominent Soviet art photographers were famously using Leicas in the 1920s, and the Fed factory wanted them to replace them with Feds. Factory officials sent several models to Pravda, the main daily paper, in 1934, and requested that above photographs in the paper, the editors include the caption, quote, "This picture was taken by Fed," unquote. Additionally, the factory agreed to become the newspaper's camera supplier. The most frequent buyers of special orders of Fed cameras were sectors of the NKVD and the Red Army. Several Gulag camps and NKVD building projects, including the infamous construction of the Moscow-Volga Canal, requested a total of roughly 200 Fed cameras in 1934. These requests increased as time went on. In 1939, about 1,500 Fed cameras went to different NKVD offices, and 3,000 went to either the Red Army or the Navy. Another 1,500 were sent as exports, an example of Soviet technological achievement to allies. The factory could only send Feds to allies where the Leica was not patented, however, meaning that the main recipients were Western China, Mongolia, Tuva, and Afghanistan. While a total of 6,000 cameras removed from the general market may not seem like a significant number, it is important to remember that the Fed factory was still producing only about 15,000 to 20,000 cameras a year. Moreover, these numbers only include what contracts survive in archives, and it's possible that more were being sent. These orders rarely specified why the NKVD or Red Army sectors requested the cameras or what they were ultimately used for. One document gives a clue, however. One 1936 order requested 3 Fed cameras to be used on test flights of new aircrafts to ensure the proper functioning of all instruments. Fed cameras thus could be used while test driving new machinery and weaponry as a quality assurance measure. In one 1938 order, 412 Fed cameras were sent to the Department of the First Directorate of the NKVD. Whether it was for use in the foreign intelligence work that this department did, or because NKVD agents simply wanted their own cameras and had this connection with the factory, is unclear. The same year, 500 were sent to different NKVD schools, perhaps as a teaching tool or for teaching photography, or again, because trainees were being rewarded with a luxury consumer item. Regardless, the cameras were considered an elite Soviet-made technological device that those in positions of power and access would want. To conclude, I'd like to briefly sketch how this connects to post-war amateur photography. First, many Red Army soldiers had their first encounters with photography while serving. War memoirs recount either finding a Fed or a looted German camera and then taking up the hobby. The pre-war Soviet military Feds thus became post-war family cameras. When Germany invaded, the Fed factory was all but destroyed, with supplies and workers evacuated to Moscow. There, that infrastructure formed the base for the new post-war factory, KMZ, which modeled the Zorky and the Zenit on the Fed, and therefore modeled them also on the Leica too. Each of these models were produced in the millions and were very popular with amateurs. Gomes and other Leningrad factories were consolidated in the post-war era, and several models, including the Smena and Komsomolets, that were in development in the 1930s entered the market after the war. The pre-war period laid the groundwork, developing models, building machinery, honing expertise for the post-war boom in camera production. In the 1930s, cameras had not yet emerged as primarily a hobby item for amateurs, but were understood by producers as a military and specialists device. This categorization brought in investment by both the NKVD and Red Army, enabling photography's later emergence as a true mass hobby in the late 1940s and 1950s, which in itself is a topic for another paper. Thank you.